The billionaire left a $100 tip to test the black waiter, which he said caused her to rewrite her will. The $100 bill landed on the wet table like a silent provocation, the woman's eyes studying David Williams' every move as he cleared the empty tables in the restaurant. It was almost 2 a.m. when Margaret Ashford entered the small 24-hour establishment in the city center. At 74, a real estate billionaire, she wasn't there by chance. Dressed discreetly, she watched David work for an entire hour, how he treated every customer with the same courtesy, how he meticulously organized every detail, how his tired eyes still managed to smile at a crying child at the next table. David, 28, worked 3 jobs to support his sick mother and finish his nursing degree. That early morning shift at the restaurant was just one of the many sacrifices he made every day, without complaining, without playing the victim. When Margaret got up to leave, she purposely left the $100 bill on the dirty table, along with her bill of only $12. That's when David called her. "Ma'am, you forgot your change," he said, running after her in the empty parking lot, holding the $88 that would be left over from the absurdly generous tip. Margaret turned around, feigning surprise. "I didn't forget. It's for you." "I can't accept that," David replied, handing the money back. "You don't know me. I haven't done anything to deserve a $100 tip for a coffee and a sandwich." "But you need it, don't you?" Margaret teased, testing his integrity. David hesitated for a moment. $100 meant medicine for his mother, it meant a week's worth of lunches, it meant not having to take out another loan. But as he looked at this elegant lady, something inside him refused to accept charity disguised as generosity. "Everyone needs money, ma'am. But integrity is priceless." Margaret felt something stir in her chest. It had been a long time since she had heard someone choose dignity over easy money. In a world where her own children, Jessica and Thomas, measured every conversation with her by the size of the inheritance they would receive, here was a complete stranger returning a fortune. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Margaret said, putting away the money David had refused. "Why do you work so hard? 3 jobs isn't normal for someone your age." "My mother has diabetes. She raised 4 children on her own, working as a cleaning lady her whole life. Now it's my turn to take care of her," David explained simply. "It's not a sacrifice when you love someone." Those words hit Margaret like a slap in the face. When was the last time her children showed her unconditional love? When was the last time someone in her family did something for her without expecting anything in return? As David returned to finish his shift, Margaret remained in the parking lot, watching him through the window. If this story about integrity and values touched you, be sure to subscribe to the channel because what happened next not only changed David's life, but exposed shocking truths about the Ashford family that even she didn't know. What Margaret didn't know was that this simple refusal of a tip was about to reveal family secrets that would force her to make the most radical decision of her life. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. David's words echoed in her mind, "Integrity is priceless." When was the last time she heard something like that from someone close to her? Certainly not from her own children. The next morning, Jessica called before 8 o'clock. "Mom, I need an urgent favor. Can you transfer $50,000 to my account? It's for an important investment." "What kind of investment?" Margaret asked, testing her. "Oh, you wouldn't understand. Modern business stuff," Jessica replied impatiently. "Can I count on it or not?" Margaret hung up without answering. 2 hours later, Thomas sent a message. "Hi Mom. I remembered you mentioned revising your will. Can we talk about it? I have some important suggestions." Suggestions. As if a lifetime of business decisions needed guidance from 2 children who had never worked a day in their lives for anything that wasn't guaranteed by the family fortune. That afternoon, Margaret returned to the restaurant. Not to test David again, but to observe. She sat in the corner, ordered only a coffee, and watched. David was at the same frantic pace as always. He waited tables, cleaned dishes, organized the stock. But Margaret noticed details she had missed the night before. How he discreetly stored leftover food in containers to take away. How his eyes lit up when a family with small children entered the restaurant. How he always found time to listen to the older customers who came there just for the company. "David has 2 other jobs besides this one," commented Lisa, the oldest waitress, as she passed Margaret's table. "He works at a rehabilitation clinic in the morning and cleans offices at dawn. I've never seen anyone so dedicated." Why doesn't he get a better job? Margaret asked, pretending to be just a curious customer. He's finishing nursing school, but he has to pay his mother's bills. Diabetes is expensive, you know? And he won't accept help from anyone. He's too proud, Lisa explained, unaware that she was talking to someone who could solve all of David's financial problems with a simple phone call. Margaret watched David serve a table where a well-dressed man rudely complained about the temperature of the food. David remained calm and polite, redoing the order without question. When the man left without tipping after making David run back and forth for 40 minutes, David simply cleared the table and smiled at the next customer. This behavior deeply angered Margaret. Not David's attitude, but the customer's arrogance. That man treated David as if he were invisible, disposable. Just as Jessica and Thomas treated employees, waiters, anyone they considered inferior. That night, Margaret called Thomas. I need you to meet me for dinner tomorrow. I have something important to discuss. Sure, Mom. Is it about the will? Because Jessica and I have been talking, and we have some ideas about how to better protect the family estate. Just come, Margaret interrupted. The dinner was revealing in ways Thomas could never have imagined. Margaret had purposely chosen a simple restaurant, not unlike the place where David worked. Thomas spent the entire time complaining about the service, the food, the cheap decor. He treated the waiter like a subordinate, snapped his fingers to get attention, and deliberately left a mess on the table. Why are we in this awful place, Mom? Our usual restaurant would be much more appropriate for a conversation about family business, Thomas muttered, wiping his fork with his napkin as if the place were contaminated. Margaret looked at the son she had raised and felt a mixture of shame and painful clarity. Thomas, at 35, had never worked a day in his life. He lived off an allowance, drove cars she paid for, lived in apartments she financed. And yet he treated honest workers as if they were less than human. Tell me about your plans for when I'm no longer here, Margaret said calmly. Thomas perked up. Well, first we'll sell some less profitable properties. Lay off unnecessary employees to cut costs. Jessica has contacts at Swiss banks to protect the assets. We can outsource the operation overseas and... What about the people who have worked for me for decades? The families who depend on these jobs? Mom, business is business. Sentimentality doesn't generate profit, Thomas replied, as if explaining something obvious to a child. Margaret nodded silently. There was the confirmation of what she had suspected. Her children would see her death as an opportunity for enrichment, not as a loss. They would turn decades of work into cold numbers on a spreadsheet. When Thomas left the restaurant without thanking the waiter or leaving an adequate tip, Margaret remained at the table. She watched the young server patiently clean up the mess Thomas had deliberately made. The young man worked with the same dignity and care that David had shown, even though he was treated like trash. Margaret left a $200 tip and a note. Thank you for your patience. You deserve to be treated with respect. Driving home that night, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She had spent her life building an empire, but she had failed miserably at building a family that would honor it. Thomas and Jessica were products of privilege without responsibility, wealth without purpose. David, on the other hand, was everything she had tried to instill in her own children: hard work, integrity, compassion, humility. He possessed real wealth, wealth of character. It was then that Margaret realized she had been testing the wrong person her entire life. Every new humiliation she witnessed, every cruel act of her children, only strengthened a growing conviction that even she couldn't quite name yet, but that was about to rewrite the fate of a billion-dollar fortune in ways none of them could have imagined. Margaret woke up that morning with a clarity of mind she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in decades, she knew exactly what she needed to do. She called Arthur Brennan, her trusted lawyer of more than 20 years. Arthur, I need you to come to my house today. It's urgent and strictly confidential. Of course, Margaret. Is something wrong? On the contrary. Something is finally right. While she waited, Margaret did something she hadn't done in a long time. She cooked. She prepared a simple but carefully made breakfast. Every movement in the kitchen reminded her of the values she had lost sight of during years of executive meetings and business dinners. Arthur arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying his worn leather briefcase and a worried look. Margaret, you look different. I feel lighter, she replied, pouring coffee into simple cups, not the expensive porcelain she used to impress visitors. Arthur, I want to completely rewrite my will. Everything. The lawyer nearly dropped his cup. Margaret, this is a very serious decision. Your children. My children have disappointed me in ways I am only now willing to admit. Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the city she had helped build. Last night, I had dinner with Thomas. He treated the waiter like trash, Arthur. Trash. And when I asked him about his plans for the company, he talked about laying off long-time employees as if they were numbers on a spreadsheet. Arthur took notes silently. He had known Margaret long enough to know when she had made an irreversible decision. Is there anyone specific you have in mind? Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. Yes. A young man named David Williams. He works as a waiter at the 24-hour restaurant on 5th Street. A waiter. Arthur couldn't hide his surprise. Arthur, have you ever seen Thomas build anything in his life? Has Jessica ever created a single job? David works 3 jobs to care for his sick mother and finish nursing school. That's more character than my children have shown in 35 years combined. Over the next few weeks, Margaret discreetly hired a private investigator. Not to find dirt on David, she wanted to confirm that her first impression was correct. The report arrived 10 days later and exceeded her expectations. David Williams, 28 years old. Orphaned by his father at 12. He took care of his younger siblings while his mother worked. Exemplary grades in school, but he turned down college scholarships so he wouldn't abandon his family. He's worked since he was 15. 0 criminal record. Volunteered at shelters on weekends when he had free time. My God, Margaret murmured, reading each page. This boy is everything I tried to teach my children. But it wasn't just about David. Margaret began a quiet investigation into her own children. What she discovered made her sick. Thomas had used the family name to obtain fraudulent contracts. Jessica was secretly selling company insider information to competitors. Both had hidden bank accounts in tax havens, preparing for an eventual complete theft of the family assets. They're stealing from me while I plan to leave everything to them, Margaret told Arthur during one of their weekly meetings. It's almost poetic. Arthur arranged everything legally. An irrevocable trust, structured so that it would be impossible to contest. Margaret would retain complete control while she was alive, but after her death, David would inherit everything: the company, the properties, the investments. Thomas and Jessica would receive only a token amount and a detailed explanation of why. Meanwhile, Margaret began frequenting the restaurant where David worked. Not to test him again, but to observe. And with each visit, her conviction grew stronger. On a particularly busy night, she saw David share his own snack with a homeless man who came in asking only for water. On another occasion, he spent 40 minutes comforting a single mother whose card had been declined, discreetly paying her bill out of his own pocket. He has natural compassion, Margaret explained to Arthur. It's not an act. It's who he is. Margaret also discovered that David was only 6 months away from graduating with a nursing degree, but had paused his studies because the shifts of the hospital internship were unpaid and he couldn't afford to stop working. That's when Margaret had a brilliant idea. Arthur, I want to create a foundation for nursing scholarships. Starting with David Williams. He doesn't know who you are, Margaret. How will you explain it? I'll say that the foundation selects candidates based on merit and need. Which is true. Margaret smiled. I want him to finish his studies before he inherits everything. I want him to know that he achieved his success on his own merits. The scholarship was offered to David 2 weeks later. Margaret watched from a distance as he received the news in the restaurant. Tears of relief and gratitude rolled down the young man's face. He immediately called his mother, his voice trembling with emotion. Mom, we did it. I'll be able to finish nursing school. That night, Margaret slept better than she had in years. For the first time, she was using her fortune to build something, not just accumulate it. But the best was yet to come. Thomas and Jessica had begun to press more intensely about the will. They had no idea that each new display of greed only strengthened Margaret's resolve. Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about succession, Jessica said during a tense dinner. You're not getting any younger. And some of your recent decisions have been questionable, Thomas added. Maybe it's time to transfer some responsibilities. Margaret nodded calmly. You're right. It's time for some important changes. Her children looked at each other, satisfied. Finally, their mother was being sensible. What they didn't know was that Margaret had just signed the final documents for David's trust that very afternoon. In a matter of months, when she publicly announced her decision, the look of triumph on their faces would turn into something very different. As she watched Thomas and Jessica secretly celebrate what they thought was their imminent victory, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction. They had spent their entire lives underestimating the importance of basic human decency. Now they were about to discover that sometimes genuine kindness is worth more than privileged blood, and that a mother wounded by years of disrespect can be far more strategic than two spoiled children could ever imagine. The plan was in motion, and every piece was falling perfectly into place. David remained the person of integrity Margaret had recognized that first night, while Thomas and Jessica continued to reveal their true greedy nature. Soon, the world would discover that some inheritances are earned through character, not birthright. And that justice, when well planned, can be the sweetest revenge. The moment of truth arrived in a way that neither Thomas nor Jessica could have predicted. Margaret had planned everything down to the smallest detail. It would not be a private conversation or a discreet announcement. It would be public, definitive, and documented. Mom organized a press conference. Thomas asked Jessica on the phone, his voice thick with confusion. To announce the succession of the company? That doesn't make sense. Maybe she's finally recognizing our importance, Jessica replied, but something in her voice betrayed a growing unease. Let's go find out. The main hall of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel was packed. Financial journalists, company executives, lawyers, former employees. Margaret had invited everyone who mattered in the business world. Thomas and Jessica arrived expecting to be introduced as the new leaders of the Ashford Empire. Margaret took the podium with an energy her children hadn't seen in years. At 74, she seemed more determined and lucid than ever. Thank you for coming. Today I am announcing fundamental changes to the structure of Ashford Enterprises and the disposition of my personal estate. She paused, watching the faces in the audience. But first, I'd like you to meet someone. David Williams entered the hall, clearly uncomfortable in his best borrowed suit. He had no idea what was going on. Margaret had only said she needed him to attend an important event related to the foundation that had sponsored his nursing studies. This is David Williams, Margaret continued. Many of you don't know him, but I've known him for months. Hardworking, honest, compassionate. Someone who chooses to do the right thing even when no one is looking. Thomas and Jessica looked at each other, a feeling of unease growing in their stomachs. Over the past few months, I've hired investigators to evaluate not only David, but also my own children. Margaret gestured to a screen that descended behind her. The results were enlightening. The first image showed bank statements from Thomas's offshore accounts. The second, emails from Jessica's selling company insider information. The third showed recordings of both of them ridiculing employees and planning to lay off hundreds of people as soon as they took control. The room fell completely silent. Jessica, Margaret said calmly, would you like to explain this $2 million transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands? Or this recorded conversation where you promise our competitors inside information about our company? Jessica turned pale. Mom, I can explain. Thomas, Margaret continued, perhaps you can tell us about this fraudulent contract where you used the family name to secure a public works project you never intended to complete? Thomas tried to stand up, but his legs gave way. This is a setup. Is it? Margaret smiled coldly. We have recordings, Thomas. Of you two planning how to divide the company's assets as soon as I died. Planning to fire loyal employees who have worked here for decades. Planning to sell historic properties to unscrupulous developers. The screen now showed video recordings. Thomas and Jessica in a restaurant, drinking expensive champagne, laughing as they discussed how to clean house once they took control. Jessica commenting that sentimental old people like Mom didn't understand modern business. Thomas saying he couldn't wait to get rid of the useless employees Mom insists on keeping out of pity. Every word was recorded, Margaret explained calmly. Every financial transaction was tracked. Every act of betrayal was documented. David, still not fully comprehending what was happening, watched in horror as revelations about people he didn't even know were laid bare. Now, Margaret continued, I would like to announce the changes to the company structure and the disposition of my estate. The room was so quiet that Thomas and Jessica's heavy breathing could be heard. Effective immediately, David Williams becomes the sole heir to my entire personal estate and beneficiary of an irrevocable trust that includes all shares of Ashford Enterprises. The impact of the words was like a bomb going off. David staggered, having to lean against the wall. Reporters began shouting questions. Thomas yelled, "This is crazy," while Jessica simply collapsed into her chair, her legs no longer supporting her. To my biological children, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the chaos, I leave $10,000 each. And a lesson they should have learned long ago: character is not inherited. It is earned. Thomas exploded. You're giving billions to a waiter. A complete stranger. David is not a stranger, Margaret replied calmly. You are. You two have spent your entire lives treating people like David as if they were less than human. Now you will find out what it's like to live without the privileges you never knew how to appreciate. Jessica finally managed to speak, her voice breaking. Mom, we can change. I don't believe that anymore, Margaret said simply. You've had 35 years to show who you really are. And you have. David, finally processing the magnitude of what was happening, approached the microphone. Mrs. Ashford, I can't accept this. I don't deserve. David, Margaret interrupted gently, you're the only person in this room who said that. And that's exactly why you deserve it. The cameras captured it all. The complete disintegration of Thomas and Jessica, who stormed out of the hall screaming, threatening lawsuits they knew were futile. The shock and gratitude of David, who wept openly. The serene satisfaction of Margaret, who had finally corrected the biggest mistake of her life, believing that blood was more important than character. As the reporters dispersed and the last camera lights went out, one question hung in the air. What would the future hold for an empire built on ambition, but now led by kindness? And would Thomas and Jessica be able to accept that their own choices had led them to ruin, or would they attempt one last desperate move to regain what they had lost forever? 6 months after the press conference that shook the corporate world, David Williams was unrecognizable. Not physically, but in the confidence he now radiated. Sitting at the same conference table where Margaret had built her empire, he led his first annual meeting as CEO of Ashford Enterprises. Our profits are up 23% this year, David announced to an audience of executives and investors. But more importantly, 0 layoffs. In fact, we've hired 400 new employees and raised the company's minimum wage by 35%. The applause was genuine. David had proven that compassion and profit were not opposing concepts. He had turned empty offices into daycare centers for employees, implemented continuing education programs, and created a medical emergency fund that had already helped hundreds of families. Meanwhile, Thomas and Jessica Ashford were living a very different reality. Thomas, sued for fraud and with his bank accounts frozen, worked as a salesman in an electronics store. His former social connections avoided him as if he were contagious. Jessica, banned from the financial sector after revelations about insider trading, gave private math lessons to make ends meet. Have you seen the news? Thomas asked Jessica during one of the rare meetings they still had, in a cheap cafe far from the elegant places they used to frequent. Mom's waiter won the Entrepreneur of the Year award, Jessica replied bitterly. Meanwhile, I can barely pay the rent. The irony was brutal. David, who had served coffee in simple cups, was now on the cover of business magazines. Thomas and Jessica, who were born with silver spoons in their mouths, were discovering the bitter taste of earning an honest living for the first time. Margaret, who had passed away peacefully 2 months after the transfer of assets, left personal letters for each of her children. The words were harsh but necessary. The money you coveted so much never made you happy. Perhaps the need to build something on your own merit will finally make you better people. David kept a photo of Margaret on his desk. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude. He had learned from her that true leadership was about serving, not being served. Every decision he made in the company, he asked himself, would this honor the trust she placed in me? The transformation at Ashford Enterprises was tangible. Longtime employees commented that the atmosphere had completely changed. It's as if the company finally has a soul, said Robert, an accountant for 20 years. Mr. David knows our names, asks about our families. It seems impossible, but we work harder, earn more, and are treated like people. David never forgot where he came from. Every Tuesday, he had lunch at the same restaurant where he had worked, talking to Lisa and other employees who had witnessed his journey from the beginning. Not out of nostalgia, but to stay connected to his roots. Margaret's true revenge against Thomas and Jessica was not to leave them poor. It was to force them to discover who they really were without the shield of inherited privilege. And for many observers, the lesson was clear: authentic character always trumps a silver spoon. David proved something that our society sometimes forgets, commented an editorial in the Financial Times. Integrity is not a luxury for those who can afford it. It is a daily choice that defines who we really are. The story of David Williams has become legendary in the business world. The waiter who refused a $100 tip and earned a billion-dollar empire because he knew how to value what really matters: dignity, honest work, and genuine compassion. This story teaches us that true wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in character. That extraordinary opportunities come to those who demonstrate extraordinary values. And that sometimes, refusing what we want leads us exactly to what we deserve. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that genuine kindness still moves mountains in this world.